And I take the opportunity of inviting the first speaker of our 3-day faculty development program, Professor Dr. Amit S Ray, who is the Professor of Economics, Center for International Trade and Development, Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. Professor Amit S Ray is an alumnus of Presidency College and the University of Oxford, from where he received his DPhil in economics in 1988. Professor Ray joined JNU as associate professor in 1995 and became professor with effect from January 2000. In between, he's been Director, Center for Development Studies, Trivandrum during 2013 to 2016, and Chair Professor at the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, New Delhi during 2008 to 2010. Prior to joining JNU, he held teaching and research positions at premier universities and institutions in India and abroad, including Oxford University, Institute of Economics and Statistics, International Food Policy Research Institute at Washington, DC, University of Calcutta, and Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Public Health, London in 2007, and he's been a member of Independent Commission of Development and Health in India since 2008. We are absolutely honored to have a person of the eminence and stature of Professor Amit S Ray, and who better than you to kick off this 3-day FDP, sir. The floor is all yours now.
Thank you very much indeed. I am absolutely honored to be invited to speak to such an eminent group of journalists and journalism teachers. And I'm grateful to the Press Club Kolkata and the Unicef for thinking of me to kickstart this session. I must confess at the very outset that I don't know any technicalities about journalism, but I'm extremely happy to see that you wanted to start off this session with an understanding of how economists look at development. Because, you know, we talk about development, everybody talks about development. Especially in a democracy, people are free to ask questions about the society and the state they live in. So debates on development performance of countries and states feature prominently in popular as well as scholarly discourses, if I may add, particularly in the run-up to the elections. You know, you see a lot of, you know, hype about people talking about which region is doing better, which state has done better. And naturally, particularly in a federal structure, there is bound to be a widely divergent development experience and trajectory to be seen. So much of these debates in popular discourse do reflect a variety of perceptions regarding what constitutes economic development. Well, some states would highlight their outstanding growth performance in terms of per capita income. Others may showcase their achievement in social outcomes like health, education, inclusiveness, etc. Yet others may stress that we are the best in terms of peace, governance, social cohesion, and so on and so forth. And some states might sort of flaunt their investment climate as an indicator of development performance. So clearly, therefore, economic development is not perceived to be merely economic growth and prosperity, but includes a multitude of goals and dimensions. So in the midst of the political debates, what, you know, individual states try to do is to pick and choose those aspects of development, showcase them the best. This creates confusion among ordinary people and among even journalists, I guess. The competing claims from different states about how well they have performed. I mean, you must have seen huge advertisements, you know, showcasing the performance, development performance of different states, you know, each highlighting we are the best in this. But what does it come to? What does it add up to? Now, these claims, none of them which are factually incorrect, would definitely fail to portray a consistent, comprehensive, accurate, and comparable picture of development performance of different states and regions. And well, I can think of the legendary story of the elephant and the six blind men. They are looking at different aspects of the elephant. They are describing the elephant. None of them are wrong, but we are not getting a picture of what the elephant is actually like. So with this metaphor, let me delve deeper into how this concept of development evolved in economic thinking. So the very idea of development, can be traced back to the classical economic thinkers like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Karl Marx. So they primarily looked at development as a process of generating larger and larger domestic product or gross domestic products. There are certain terminologies which I presume as a budding development journalist you would be acquainted with. So GDP is a concept that sort of reflects the total volume of output being produced in a society or a country. And in the classical economic thinking, the whole idea was to focus on the size of the GDP, the size of the pie. The larger the size of the pie, the greater would be your indicator of development. And the growth of this size would actually reflect economic growth, which often tended to be synonymously used as development. Now, there are many problems with this. I'll come to that in a minute. But before that, I would like to say, you see, if you are trying to understand development as a process of enlarging the size of the national income or the size of the gross domestic product, the development theory that sort of emerged out of this thinking, and it sort of started in the, with the post-colonial period, from the 50s and 60s in particular, that is the emergence of development economics as a sub-discipline in economics, which tried to understand problems of economic development. Because the classical economic thinkers didn't specify underdevelopment as such. They talked about, Adam Smith, as we all know, wrote a book called The Wealth of the Nation. And if we try to understand what he meant by wealth and prosperity, it's basically this. And he sort of suggested ways and means of how nations can grow more prosperous. Then came David Ricardo, Karl Marx. All of them have they are very divergent in their conclusions, but they have a common thematic idea of how development or how prosperity can be augmented. And that is primarily through a process of industrialization-led economic growth. So you have to develop industries, and with the development of industries in a capitalistic structure of production, as you keep on reinvesting the surplus, you become a nation becomes more and more prosperous, and then it becomes developed. Now, this was going fine, 50s and 60s. If you look at the development policy making of that period, look at India. Most post-colonial, developing countries, started on the path of industrialization-led development. But 2 or 3 decades down the line, it was pretty clear that yes, the size of the pie is increasing, but underdevelopment, as popularly understood, was absolutely visible, So something somewhere was clearly going amiss. And that's where, the concept of development started getting a bit broadened. So from per capita GDP as an indicator of a nation's development status, people started, I mean, World Bank classified nations according to per capita GDP and said, okay, these are the least developed, then, then you have these middle developing, then sort of upper, and then the rich and whatever, they have these middle income countries and the high income countries. So all that was done on the basis of per capita GDP. Because the dominant idea was that itself is important for a nation to become developed. So, what is the problem with that thinking? The problem with that thinking is manifold. I'm not going to touch upon all of them, but there is one clear economic problem with this. And I'm just going to explain it to you in layman's language. I mean, there are very complicated economic models explaining this, but think of it. Think of it as an individual. Suppose I'm earning something this year and I decide that I will, is that a reflection of how well, of my well-being, how much I can spend? No, definitely not. Because suppose if I earn something this year and I have no income for the next 5 years, then I have to have some provisions for future. So therefore, when we talk about GDP-based sort of measures of development, of course, we take care of depreciation, we take care of the wear and tear of the regular capital stock, but we are not really, sort of addressing the issue of present versus future consumption. So a society, it doesn't, you might need to have a provision and might have to have a trade-off. Whatever you produce may not reflect your actual well-being in terms of consuming that whole thing. So the entire pie cannot be eaten up. All right. So that's one problem. Let us not get into too much of details. The second problem, which is a major problem, is inter-country comparison or inter-regional comparison of development standards. If you look at per capita GDP, there are standard problems. So if you look at the US per capita GDP in dollar terms, in nominal dollars, and you convert that into Indian rupees at the going exchange rate, it'll look several times more than India. But actually is the quality of life, let's define development as I said, well-being of the people, how well the people are. If that is what is, our objective, then does per capita income? No, it doesn't. Because suppose you have $100 bill in the US, the things that you can get, and you convert that into 100 times 75, and 7,500 rupees, 7,500 rupees in India would get a much larger basket of goods. So if you think of certain common things, that every person requires, maybe a common basket, and compare the price of that common basket in India with the common basket in the US, then if you compare that price ratio, that will give you an exchange rate of actual how effectively, $1 translates into how many rupees. And there you would see possibly $1 translates into maybe 10 or 15 rupees. Because, there, even if you hop into the bus, you'll be paying $2, which is like 140 rupees. Here, you hop into a bus, you spend 10 rupees. All right. So I'm just giving you an example. So if somebody has 7,500 rupees in his pocket in Kolkata, which is very different from having $100 bill in his pocket in New York. So therefore, just, then there is this, there are ways of doing it, which not known as the purchasing power parity calculation to overcome this problem. But it doesn't overcome the problem fully, and I'll come to that later, because what you consider is an essential bundle in America may be different from what you consider as an essential bundle in India. So there is always this problem, of how do you really compare the well-being of an average citizen of India with the well-being of the average citizen of the USA. So therefore, that's another problem, so using per capita GDP. Second, GDP does not take into account any non-market transactions. All right. So, for instance, we have in India a large unpaid care sector. We look after our own children. We do not have institutional or market-based supports for the elderly care of the elderly. Everything is monetized and marketized in many of this is marketized in the US, which will be accounted for in the national income accounting of the US. That doesn't mean these services are not going on. These goods and services are not being produced in this country, in India. But of course, the non-market part of it will never be captured by the GDP. And finally, when we look at the per capita GDP, it's just an average. Now, the average citizen is like that, but it does not tell us anything about the distribution. So therefore, there is an inherent problem in comparing just the averages. So these are among the most important, limitations of using per capita GDP, which has been used for several decades from 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s on, and even, used as a common sort of indicator now as a development, as a measure or a concept of development. So now, if we look at development policies throughout the 50s and 60s, as I said, it was focused on this. And, there is another strand of literature, which is known as the structural change literature, which talks about how, as a country develops, the structure of the economy changes from being a predominantly agricultural society to an industrial society to a service-driven society. So there are like these three phases that were identified. These are stereotypes. And these stereotypes are also based on the same presumption that it's per capita GDP that we are obsessed with when we try to understand development, and industrialization-led growth is the goal or the path of development. So now, this will not clearly adequately address all problems. That was evident from the 70s, 80s. People realized that, poverty is still remaining, undernutrition is still remaining. So all indicators, all this industrialization-led economic growth was not getting translated into, visible development outcomes. Now, that's what made economists start rethinking about development. And there, a new concept first came. The focus was on poverty. And this was, of course, one of the multilateral, international development agencies, the World Bank, under, Robert McNamara. There was a clear focus on poverty as the sole, objective of trying to push the developing world out of their underdevelopment trap. So rather than just focusing on industrialization, attack poverty, try to direct attack on poverty, try to get people out of poverty, So that was one focus that came. And of course, there are, immediately people started talking about different measures of poverty. There was this headcount measure. The problem is, how do you define poverty? For that, you have to define a poverty line. And how do you define a poverty line? You decide about a bundle of goods which is essential for your survival. If you don't have resources to buy those goods, then you are considered not being able to meet even the essential ingredients of life, and that's when you are called poor. So if you have a line defined like that, then if your income is below that line, then you are poor. So head count is basically counting everybody who falls under that line. Suppose the poverty line is 100 rupees. I'm just giving an example. Now, if your income is less than 100, then you are poor. So you can just count and say that out of the total population, so many are poor. But then the problem with this is, if my income is 90, then I'm poor, and your income is 20, you are also poor. But that is really not a fair comparison, right? So, we need to see how deep are you in poverty. So then there is this concept of gap. So if, I am only falling short by 10 rupees, then I should have a different weight. And if I'm falling short by, 90 rupees, I should be treated differently. And so there is this concept of weighted, head count and weighted gap. So that's the focus on poverty that came up, especially in the decades of the 70s, in particular. And related to poverty, then people said, why just look at poverty as an adequate income level and provide them with the adequate income? Why not identify the basic needs of the poor? If we are looking at development, then we must understand what is it that causes these people to be below a threshold level of development, So food, shelter, clothing, and certain essential public services. If these are identified as the basic needs, then why don't we consider providing these services directly rather than trying to see that they have an adequate income level of whatever the poverty line to buy these services? So that was another approach, which was known as the basic needs approach. Now, over time, from this, people started, and then, it was like in the 80s, and poverty, basic needs, all these approaches to tackle development required massive resources from the government. Now, in the 80s, with the structural adjustments and the global economy in a turmoil, particularly the developing world, in Latin America in particular, there was huge fiscal crisis, and the Washington consensus, commanded that, fiscal deficits should be kept under control. Now, if you are keeping fiscal deficits under control, then clearly you can't be lavish and say, okay, I'll attack poverty by, transferring money to the poor to bring them to that level of basic level of, earnings, or I provide these basic needs, to them. All this went out of the window, and inequality worsened, during this period. So that from there, there emerged the concept of human development. Now, what is human development, which was pioneered by Amartya Sen and Mahabubul Haq, where they put human beings at the center stage of conceptualizing development. It's no longer how much output you produce, and what kind of goods. Are actually looking at human beings and then trying to see how you can sort of, identify the basic parameters of development. Okay. So, and, there are two reasons for this. Okay. First of all, the first reason was the theoretical basis of welfare economics, positing welfare as a function of consumption, was challenged. Why was that? I may consume certain things, but that may not really make or translate into my well-being. Namely, yes, you provide education to them. They get education. Okay. But that doesn't mean you are capable of functioning. What does education ultimately do? What is the purpose of education? The purpose of education is to be able to be skilled and to do certain things. And that does not just depend on consuming this service called education. It will be dependent on a host of factors. Okay. So this was a very innovative way of going beyond just production and consumption to focus on capabilities and freedom. So the basic idea is that development does not exclusively consist of goods and services that are consumed. Rather, development consists of the ability to do things. So, for instance, instead of thinking of education as a good or a service that is being consumed and hence provides welfare, education is essentially an enabling input to live a meaningful and purposeful life. The perspective from which one views activities is different. As we discuss, the emphasis now shifts from what one consumes to what he can actually do as a result of these, production and consumption activities. So that is, being able to do is capability. Now, you may be capable of doing some things, but you may not have the freedom to do it. So this concept of capability, human development, looked at capability and then coupled it with freedom. So development should entail the freedom to do things. A child should not be forced to become a doctor or an engineer because parents want it. A child should have the freedom to choose what he wants to do. So that also is an essential, and if we can promote a society where everybody can nurture one's capability according to one's freedom of choice, that should be perceived as true development. Now, this is a very tall order, of course, and we will come to it in a minute. When we talk about, that is the crux of what I'm going to talk about, is the Stiglitz Commission. But before that, once this UNDP human development focus was introduced, and then UNDP came up with a very simple index of looking at education, health, and material prosperity as three essential components of enabling an individual to develop one's capability and freedom in a very crude way, and came up with an index of human development, which stood on three pillars: health, education, and prosperity. Stiglitz Commission, which was a commission which was set up by the French President Sarkozy, and with Joseph Stiglitz Nobel laureate as its chair, and Amartya Sen as its member, came up with an extensive report, and that, I guess, all of you should read, because it's the most comprehensive conceptualization of development, talking about 6 or 7 or 8 dimensions of development, going beyond material prosperity. Okay, so I'll come to that in a minute, but before that, I should also talk about the UN, approach towards development. From the Human Development Report, then the United Nations came to the Millennium Development Goals, and where they sort of set specific goals, to achieve developmental outcomes, and these goals, there were 8 goals and various targets within these goals which were defined, and it was kind of a declaration where countries were supposed to work towards very specific policy directions to meet these targets, rather than this is kind of a deviation from the earlier paradigm of development theory, which was essentially macro based and led to a particular direction. This is more hands-on. Okay, so but then Millennium Development Goals has had its many criticisms, and I'm not going to go into the details of that, because then I will lose track of the dimensions that I'm going to discuss today. So after 15 years, they came up with what is known as the Sustainable Development Goals, which is basically an extension and a more comprehensive and a much stricter targets, which has like 17 goals now, expanded from 8, and with 169 targets. So it was done through a consultative process and on. I mean, when you do a consultative process, anything and everything is put in as development. For instance, I'll give you an example. Industry, innovation, and infrastructure is development. Life below water is one goal. So everything is a goal now. Okay. So, and that, I believe, we can become a bit clumsy, because when we talk about development, we also need to prioritize a bit, and we cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach for all nations. What is a priority for us may be slightly different from what is a priority for another developing country. So therefore, without wasting more time, because I am already running out of time a bit, and I would also like to leave a little time for discussions, I would like to move on to the core of my presentation, which looks at the multidimensionality of development. And as a practicing development journalist, what are the different dimensions that you should keep in mind when you actually try to report development? Let us not be like the blind men looking at the elephant and just pick up one and say, okay, this is fantastic. Of course, you have to temper it by saying this is one aspect, but we understand. And many of these aspects are interrelated. So let us now talk about the Sarkozy, the Stiglitz Commission report, which very succinctly, identifies the dimensions of development. Okay, so the most important contribution of this report is the introduction of measurable concept of quality of life. As I said, in layman's term, I would like to define development as betterment of quality of life. And if that is the case, then we should have identifiable parameters to be able to measure different dimensions of quality of life. Quality of life is not just having a high per capita income. So conventional resource-based, which extends well beyond material resources and economic well-being. So conventional resource-based measures of economic well-being are seriously limited according to the Stiglitz Commission, and they are insufficient to capture quality of life for three reasons. First, resources are just means, and they are means. These means are transformed into well-being in different ways for different individuals. So you cannot just say having the resources means that you have well-being. Second, prices or shadow prices, will be different for different individuals, different societies. So it makes it's very difficult to make interpersonal comparisons. My preference of present versus past, future consumption may be very different from yours. So therefore, we cannot really say that, we can come with a, resource-based, availability-based measure of economic well-being. And third, life circumstances play a critical role in shaping a particular individual's quality of life that cannot be described by resources and imputable prices. So these three led to, the notion of measuring quality of life based on A, subjective well-being, B, capabilities, and C, fair allocations. Okay, that's what their objective was. So subjective well-being means, it basically refers to the philosophical tradition of acknowledging that individuals are the best judge of their own well-being, of their own subjective well-being. So therefore, the capabilities approach views individual well-being as a combination, as I said, of various functionings, their capabilities, doings or beings, like being adequately nourished, being able to participate in political debates, having freedom of speech, etc., etc., having equality in terms of gender, everything, So, and their freedom to choose this functioning. So I must have the ability and the freedom to be able to have a good quality of life, and I am the best judge for this. That's the first premise. The second approach is rooted in the philosophy of social justice, focusing on respective individuals' ability to pursue and realize the goals that he or she values. And the third approach of fair allocation is rooted in the tradition of welfare economics that allows for weighting various non-monetary dimensions of quality of life. Now, I don't want to go into the details of this because then I will lose track. So the first dimension is material prosperity. Okay, I mean, this is the conventional dimension. And what the Stiglitz Commission suggested is, please do not just focus on average per capita income, average per capita GDP as the sole indicator of material prosperity. Of course, income is very important, but then, please look at, first of all, don't look at it from the aggregate national point of view. Look at it at the household level and take an aggregate of household incomes. They can aggregate supplemented by wealth and assets. You may have income, but you may not have wealth. Then you look at consumption levels separately, and then you look at certain material, comforts, the kind of housing that you have, whether you have drainage, electricity, drinking water, sanitation. These are all indicators of material prosperity. Just having a high per capita income and, saying that, but, half the people don't have, sort of pipeline water, does not refer to development. Okay, that is the point that the Stiglitz Commission is trying to make. So when you're looking at material prosperity, go beyond. Then look at infrastructure like roads. I mean, people talked about it. Teleconnectivity. I think Professor Suresh was mentioning, how it has now been widely accepted that, so just having a high per capita income or a low per capita income could be very misleading of material prosperity. So, but that's a standard conventional, material prosperity is a very conventional, dimension. But then the second, there are 9 dimensions. So the second is health. I would like to, answer questions later, because, let me not stop the flow. Is that all right with the organizers?
Absolutely right, sir. Absolutely okay. Please go ahead, sir.
Okay. The second dimension is health. And here I cannot but, refer to Mahabharata. When Yaksha, in the great epic Mahabharata, when Yaksha asked Yudhishthir, what is the greatest gift of all? What was the reply? Health. So health, even if you are materially prosperous, if you are not in good health, your quality of life is nowhere. Okay. So therefore, the second dimension is health. And again, Sarkozy in Stiglitz Commission, looks at various dimensions of looking at health. I'm not going to go into the details because I'm running out of time. The third dimension is knowledge and education. So knowledge, of course, is another great asset that augments quality of life, especially right now in a knowledge-driven society. We have moved towards a knowledge-driven society. So which knowledge comes enlightenment, prudence, that leads us to a path of better, enjoyable life. So it brings status and happiness, it improves productivity and earnings. So a whole lot of things. And again, knowledge and education, this various, parameters you can think of. Of course, the educational inputs and outputs, enrollment, schools, learning outcomes, etc., literacy, dropouts, and then, of course, knowledge creation, research and development, number of patents being produced. All this could be indicators of the third dimension, knowledge and education. The fourth dimension, which Stiglitz Commission talks about, is personal activities. Now, this is a very difficult dimension. How much time I get to spend with me. You see people, I feel very sad when I look at these youngsters getting into fancy analytics jobs, going out for work at 10 o'clock and then coming back at 9, 10, 11 at night. No life. You see? So is that quality of life? So how much leisure time do you have? What kind of leisure possibilities do you have? All this could be a very, very important dimension. But the problem here is you don't get quantifiable data. But if anybody wants to actually do exploratory journalism, Bangalore, you see youngsters, spending time, earning pots of money. But when you probe deeper, what is your quality of life? Within 2 to 3 years, many of them get completely disgruntled, that I don't want this. So that's where the fourth dimension comes in. The fifth dimension is, of course, very conventionally talked about in political science and sociology. It constitutes political voice. Now I am well fed, I have health, I have education, everything is there, but I don't have freedom of speech. I don't have political voice. Then clearly, that reduces my quality of life. So, how much of, what is the extent of democracy, voter turnout, how, and also governance, for instance, how efficient is judiciary? If I'm wronged, how fast I can get it resolved with the legal institutional structure? All these could be a part of your quality of life. Now, 6, I'm supposed to stop at 8:30, which I'm trying my best to do actually. 6, dimension 6, social connections. And this is a very interesting dimension that the Stiglitz Commission brought out. What is social connection? You can have all this, but you live a very isolated life. And that has happened. If you look at the West, their depression, their social, Scandinavian countries, suicide rates are very high because people are not connected. If you live in a connected society, if you live in a community, that contributes to your well-being. But if you're so narrow, look at Japan. My God, I'm sure many of you must have visited. It's the city, Tokyo is like a robot. Everything runs on time. That's fantastic. But then there is, it's like people going to work, coming back, coming to work, coming back. There's absolutely no lack of. I'm not going to generalize because this is very superficial. As an academic economist, I should never do that. But I'm just trying to give you an example. Okay. So social connections, how much of club activities do you have? How are you socially integrated, etc. And it also it sort of involves your marital stability. How many divorces do you have? Social isolations, suicides. These could all be pointers towards the sixth dimension of quality of life. The seventh dimension is environment, and I don't need to mention any more because clearly if you live in a very prosperous society, in Delhi, nobody better knows it better than we do. From November to December, we die. We can't come out of our houses. It's so polluted. The air pollution, that's not quality of life. Clearly that is not quality of life. So therefore, air, water, noise, pollution, climate change, forest cover, soil quality, waste management, everything should be part of an indicator of development. Eighth is personal security. And what is personal security? How secure do I feel? Am I, what is the crime rate? Rio, I don't know if any of you visited, Rio is notorious for crime. So, you are always, extremely wary of, walking, moving out because there'll be burglary, there'll be snatching. So what's the point? The huge, every house would have an automated, huge iron gates, so that, you are well protected. What kind of a society is that? All right. So therefore, your personal security, violence, crime rates, and violence could include everything, caste violence, it could include, communal violence, it could include domestic violence, every form of violence, How effective is the police force? Okay. So these are all indicators of the eighth dimension, which is personal security. And finally, the ninth dimension is economic security. And you might be wondering, what is economic security? We have already talked about material prosperity. But no, this is different. Material prosperity, I may be materially prosperous, but I have no job security. I know that, lot of people had fancy jobs before the COVID, but with COVID, everything went out for a sixer. And there is no social security to fall back on. That is vulnerability. That is economic insecurity. And that can be measured by what is the unemployment rate. So suppose if you lose your job, if you are living in a society with very high unemployment rate, then clearly you cannot, get a job immediately back. So your dependence on agriculture could be a form of insecurity, because agriculture is more vulnerable. So how much of population is actually covered under social security schemes and provident funds, So all these could be indicators of economic insecurity. So a society which may be economically prosperous may be very economically insecure. We all know what happened after the 2008 crisis in America. Lot of fancy, high-paid, executives just got fired because they lost their jobs. The companies got bust. So therefore, and that is height of economic insecurity. So if we focus on this, if we look at development as this multi-dimensional concept, we know exactly what to look for. So we just don't look at the prosperity of or the earnings of the young people in Bangalore to say, there are many associated, issues that we should think about. Now, before I close, I would like to, talk about my own take about conceptualizing development. So development, as I said, is essentially betterment of life. And for betterment of life, I would talk about 4 pillars that are very important. The first pillar is, of course, resources. You need resources to produce the goods and services that would make your life better. But just having the resources is not good enough. So resource pillar has to be supplemented by the technology pillar or the knowledge pillar. You should have the knowledge to convert these resources into goods and services for betterment of life. Now, these are not independent pillars. Your resources can affect your technology and your technology can affect your resource pillar. But both of these pillars, in a sense, constitute the economic subsystem where we look at development purely from an economics point of view, betterment of life through goods and services. But then even there, there are 2 other things that you have to think about. One is the quality of institutions. That's the 3rd pillar. And the value system of culture, that's the 4th pillar. And I'll just give an example before ending this lecture. Think about the greatest paradigm shift in development in the history of mankind. I believe when the hunters-gatherers in primitive societies transited to an agricultural society, from hunting-gathering to settled agriculture, that I believe is a great paradigm shift in development. Now, why? Because hunting-gathering was fine, initially. They would, resources were there. They would just pluck the flowers, the fruits, and they will kill the animals, and that made them happy. They would have, whatever, natural, trees and leaves to, cover themselves, and with animal skins, etc. So things were hunky-dory. But as the population started expanding, bounties of nature started shrinking. So therefore, you have to look for enlargement of your pie. That's I was talking about the GDP. So how do you do that? That's the technological transition. People through hundreds of years of trial and error, possibly primitive men learned the technique of settled agriculture and cattle rearing. So that's the knowledge or the technology pillar interacting with the resource pillar or the scarcity of resources, prompting a paradigm shift in development. Now this couldn't have happened without supporting institutions. And what is the institution? Think of the institution of property rights. What is that property right? Earlier, it was like community forests. Anybody could go and, the fruits did not belong to any individual. It belonged to the entire tribe. So it was like common resources for everybody. But when you transit to a settled agriculture, you have to define property rights. Why? Because you build an orchard, you grow crops. It takes time, effort to grow it. And then you cannot then say that it's everybody's. Your effort has gone in. So the first thing that happened was to assign property rights to cattle, reared domesticated cattle, and standing crops. When this transition takes place, this property rights, the sense of property rights is introduced. Now, what is property right? If it's my goat, if it's my lamb, if it's my cow or my camel, then you cannot take it. I claim ownership of this. That is property rights. Now, that's the institution of property right. If you don't, you will be penalized. Now, property rights institutions cannot, stand on their own. There has to be a value system in the economy, in the society. Because earlier people were used to taking everything from whatever is available. So there was no concept of individual ownership. So if you look at early religions of this world, which started with settled agriculture and civilization, every religion would have one thing in common: thou shalt not steal. That's the culture or the value system of the society. And that's very important to support the institution of property rights, which in turn made possible the knowledge shift from using the resources from hunting-gathering society to settled agriculture. So now you see, all four pillars are crucially important. When you understand development, you cannot just look at one or the other. You need to look at all four institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this fabulous masterclass, sir. And there have been innumerable takeaways for most of us. Just for the benefit of participants, this has been recorded and it will be put up on our official YouTube channel. So we invite questions now. You please first raise your hand and then identify yourself. You can unmute and identify yourself and ask questions. So thank you, Dr. Shukla. So who better than you for the first question?
Thank you, sir. It was a very enlightening lecture. Yeah, I have one specific question, because prior to attending this FDP, I was in a conclave which was inaugurated by the Vice President. So there we were talking about, this is the Jal Jeevan mission, the Jal Shakti mission conclave that is happening on WASH. So there, from individual property rights, we are talking about communitization. That means we are talking about community ownership of, say, the VWSC or the TAP. So where do you think, how does that bring in any paradigm shift?
Excellent question. I'm so happy because, if you get started I tried to condense this lecture, which I teach for a whole semester course in development. So property rights feature very prominently in development discourse. So at one point, institutions are not static. What at one point was essential to support the development trajectory of that era, institutions need to change with the paradigm shift in development. So from communal to community property rights, you came to individual property rights, and then it sort of moved on, property rights on land, property rights on human beings. Slavery was another institution, and the value system supported it. I mean, even as late as 200 years back, America had slavery, now which is unthinkable today because of our value system. So, now I'm so glad that at long last, when we look at development focused on water, the communal ownership and community responsibility is being talked about again. So look at the way the institutional structure is again shifting, and which has to be also would have to be consistent with the changing value system. And that's where the role of journalism is absolutely important, because our mindset today has been extremely individual property right centric. We do not actually do anything that is not in our own benefit. Anything that has a common benefit, we are not used to thinking. because of centuries of this institutional structure promoting individual property rights. Even knowledge, intellectual property rights, in ancient era, it was common knowledge, and there are shlokas in Sanskrit, which says that what a wonderful asset do you have, Lady Saraswati, because this is the only asset in the world which gets augmented when you start distributing it. Whereas individual intellectual property rights say, don't keep it to yourself, give it to only those who pay. And in fact, in folklore literature, Dronacharya wanted to individualize this, as we all know. I mean, we know the story of Ekalavya. Okay, so that went against the Vedic principles of free knowledge. Common property knowledge should be free to all. And in fact, in a common folklore, it said that Dronacharya had such a undignified death because of the curse of Saraswati herself. So therefore, the value system has to go hand in hand with the changing institutional structure. I'm so glad, Dr. Shukla, you raised this question.
Thank you so much, sir. And we have just time for this one question only. I have the honor of now inviting the Honorable President, Press Club Kolkata, to formally thank Professor Ray for his fabulous address.
Well, Dr. Pandey, I have no words to thank Professor Ray, and I am nobody to speak anything on what economics he has just taught, quote unquote, or anything on that sort. But I can only say, among all the communicators, he is a perfect communicator. That what we learn always to communicate to the target audience what you are required to communicate. And communication process is not complete if the receiver doesn't understand and act. Respected sir, yes, you teach this subject throughout a semester in your school of that famous institute, famous university, rather, you can say. But you had to do it for within an hour, out of which I have also curtailed your time, which I should have not. Now I understand every minute of yours was much more relevant than every hour of mine. Thank you very much, sir, for agreeing to and coming down to us, because we, the journalists, or as we invite the media educators, because they are actually will be training development journalism, and development journalism has become a part of curriculum in almost all the universities. Development journalism, development communication, communication for development, in its one or the other avatar. So understanding development, what we would like to know, and the way you have explained the Stiglitz Commission and Professor Amartya Sen's human development, these are the inputs, these are the things which I believe that all of us will refer to the original documents and will try to develop our own understanding on the premise of what you have just narrated in 1 hour. Thank you very much. I think a well begun is half done. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.